Ravi Agrawal is the editor-in-chief of Foreign Policy and the host of FB Live, the magazine's video channel and podcast. Ravi, it's great to talk to you again. You're joining us from New York today. So look, you probe, you analyze international relations every day. So a meeting of the world's leading countries, basically to you, is like Christmas come early. What do you think is the most significant issue at play here?
Well, I think the most significant issue, if it emerges in the next couple of days, two things. One is a potential expansion of the G20 to include the African Union. I think this would be a real symbol of inclusion. It is morally the correct thing to do as well. Were the G20 to do that, I think it would be putting its money where its mouth is and trying to be more of a real voice of the global south, as it's often tried to call itself in the last year with India's presidency, and also last year with Indonesia at the helm. The next 2 years, you have Brazil and South Africa at the helm. That's a trend. The second point, I think, is linked to the first, which is debt relief. If the G20, through its sort of channeling the voice of the global south, is able to champion issues that the global south cares about, whether it is climate change payments, whether it is debt relief, whether it is better lending terms for countries that pay such high rates on their debt and they're never able to catch up. So sovereign debt crises. If the G20 is able to push some advances there, and remember the IMF and the World Bank are controlled mostly by Europe and the United States. So to change that power structure through the G20 would be an accomplishment.
If the AU, the African Union, does join the G20 would then become the G21. Would that move the needle?
A little bit. At the very least, it would give the G20 some more moral standing in that it actually has a bigger number of constituents in the global south. The AU, of course, represents Africa, so that takes on a whole continent. But the flip side of this, of course, Cyril, is that it might make the G20 more unwieldy. Why are we here? I mean, the G20 was formed as a group that was meant to tackle financial crises, I think starting with the Asian financial crisis in the 90s, but then it was revived again with the global financial crisis in 2008. Some of this is, of course, because the original multilateral institutions, the United Nations, the World Bank, the IMF, they have sort of met paralysis in the last few years, more than that, in fact. But when you have a veto sort of power at the United Nations Security Council, for example, and when you have one of those countries holding a veto power that has actually gone to war and invaded another country in the biggest war, land war since World War II, you have a problem. So the global multilateral system is under immense stress. It is broken in some senses. And that's why we're here, where these other blocks and groupings are trying to find ways to get things done. Some of them are successful, some aren't. The G7, for example, has made real advances this year, but it hasn't in years past. This is the G20's chance in the next weekend. They will likely not have a joint communique at the end of this summit, and that is because Russia will never agree to France's desire to condemn Russia for the invasion of Ukraine.
Okay, give us the scenarios then for this G20. Optimistic and pessimistic scenario for what it could achieve or fail to achieve this summit.
Well, I mean, between the two of those, I think the clear
there's a big gray area.
Realist. There's a big gray area. I think it's what is most likely is that we will not have a big agreement condemning Russia. And so I think the gray that emerges from this summit is that the world is fractured, is that, you know, the UN Secretary General may call for countries to really come together. But at the end, it all comes down to money. So, you know, if from this summit, something big emerges in terms of financing climate change initiatives in the global south or debt relief for countries that have struggled with debt, that would be a huge accomplishment. But I don't think those things are going to happen, and they haven't over the last few years. It all comes down to where is the money coming from? And that it rarely happens that rich Western countries end up financing the World Bank, the IMF, other institutions to the tune of the amounts that they need. Anything they do is a drop in the ocean. That is likely what will emerge in the next couple of days and in the lead up to COP28 in Dubai later this year. where once again, I think the onus will be on whether we come up with innovative ways to finance the big climate issues that we're facing around the world, whether it's reparations, whether it's initiatives around green energy, and the money never emerges.
All right, Ravi, thanks for that great viewer's guide to the G20 summit. Ravi Agrawal there, editor-in-chief of Foreign Policy.